Hey there, everyone. How you doing today? I just want to do a quick stream and check my audio real quick for a second. Since it's just me today, I'm gonna have to do a couple of technical things, and we'll see how the audio is. Give some people a chance to join if they want to. So, hey there, everyone. How you doing today? I just want to do a quick. So, I've been wanting to do this review of this video. Haven't had a lot of time lately. Been a lot of work, a lot of family things and stuff, but I had a little bit of time today. So the channel is called Catalyzing Faith. It's a fairly new apologetics channel, and this video kind of interested me a little bit, so I wanted to get into it. It's probably going to challenge me a little bit because he has a good grasp of a lot of concepts, but I think there's some errors in a few errors here and there. But we'll go ahead and get into it, and we'll see what he says.
A few weeks ago, I had the chance to be interviewed by my friend Joel Setcase over at the Think Institute. And while the topic was more general of science and God, there were a number of smaller discussions that occurred throughout that interview that I think are too important to miss. So I wanted to isolate some clips from that interview over here at the Catalyzing Faith channel for the purpose of further discussion. And while the topic was that are included in this video, we dive into this concept of personal agency. And there are really a couple of main points that I want to highlight here so that you don't miss them. The first is that if we are to engage in science as rational creatures, we need to have this concept of free agency to be able to engage in a process of deliberation. And this really comes out in the discussion when we start talking about artificial intelligence and specifically self-driving cars. But the second point that I don't want you to miss is how if we want to explain the fact that we have agency, then we need for the fundamental nature of reality to itself be a personal agent. Because if all we're left with are impersonal material objects, there is no way for us to rearrange them such that personal agents appear in the universe.
And so, why do we need to be imaged after?
Real quick, I'll skip back into that, but I'm gonna have the most problem with his second point, possibly the first one, that in order to do science, it requires this ability to have agency and to be able to deliberate on things. It's possible, but I would say that science is basically us responding to reference points in the universe and looking for patterns and trying to make testable predictions from those patterns. That's not all science is, but I would say that's a very bare bones, half-assed assessment of, off the top of my head, how that would work. But we'll get more into that. I'm gonna let the video keep playing, and obviously his second point is the one I'm going to have the most issue with. That this idea of agency and the fact that there are agents in the universe means that there must be some kind of fundamental agency required. So let's
in the universe.
And so, why do we need to be imaged after the personal agent?
Right. So that has to do with this idea of engaging in a legitimate process of deliberation. We need to be rational creatures, because without personal agency, if the world is just this material mess, you have a bunch of electrons, protons, really it's just physical matter and it's just rearranged in different ways. Well, then the way your brain works is no different than the way a calculator works. You press 2 + 2 on a calculator and hit the equals button. The calculator doesn't think. It doesn't say, okay, what is 2? What is this plus symbol? What is, 2 again? And then what does this equals operator mean? It just spits out an answer because the structure of the calculator necessitates that given those inputs, it'll give you a certain output. Well, your brain is effectively no different. Your brain is just physical matter rearranged in a different way. It receives inputs, spits out outputs. But if all you are is matter, then you have no you have no way to ground a legitimate process of deliberation where you weigh the options and you consider, okay, is this conclusion more rational than this conclusion? Your whatever conclusion you reach ends up just being necessitated. And if you don't think physics gets you all the way to determinism, well, your only other option is chaos. And
okay, I don't know that I agree with that dichotomy there. When we get into this idea of determinism, when we respond to, because he made the analogy about the calculator that you put in inputs and it spits out outputs. That's fine. The fact that our brain may work that way in a very loose sense is not very compelling to me, because we respond to stimulus in the universe. We respond to things that happen around us. Whether or not we are actually deciding between courses of action, that's a still debated philosophical question, versus determinism, compatibilism, things like that. But I don't see that there's a problem with saying that we are still agents, even though we may respond certain ways. Because we can recognize that, for the most part, rational creatures will do this in this given situation versus irrational creatures doing this. Like, let's say if I'm on the edge of a building, a rational creature would not take a step forward. We can say an irrational creature would take a step, or may take a step forward. An irrational creature might not take a step forward also. But it would be irrational to take a step forward if my goal is to stay alive. So saying that we have to have this process of deliberation, I don't know that I agree with that, because what we call deliberation, what we think of as this, what he's talking about is free will. What we talk about as free will may actually be just illusory. It may be a complete just wordplay. Because it's hard because you can't really show that you do have free will. We can't tell the difference between something that does actually have free will and something that just thinks it has free will. So I'm interested to see he's going to get into a little more. I've already watched this one time, and I'm trying to. It was about a week ago, so I'm not really fresh on. I can't really remember what it was he said throughout the video, so I'm kind of taking this almost as it comes. But the argument that in order to have I think we have free will, and if we have free will, we must have this agent as a fundamental source of reality, doesn't really follow to me.
In neither case is there a you actually controlling how you get from the inputs to the outputs. Now, the only way to get agency in human beings is if what I call the fundamental nature of reality itself is an agent. Because whatever we build in this universe, whatever is built itself has to come from whatever the foundation is. And agency is not the type of thing that you can get from non-agency.
Now, how do you know that agency can't arrive from non-agency? Or are you just taking that as a axiomatic principle, a starting point?
You could take it as axiomatic. You could also take it sort of evidentially. I mean,
okay, that's a problem to me, because I could take it as axiomatic or I could take it evidentially. And Joel likes to take things as axioms. Joel's a presuppositionalist. So it seems like Joel's looking for an easy way to just accept it and move on. I don't think you can just say that's axiomatic. I think that's very problematic.
Anything we build is going to be, any attempt at sort of artificial intelligence that we build, it all comes down to the programming. There's no agent behind it controlling it. It's just a computer program. So by rearranging matter, I guess you could put it one way, the unanimous, the evidence from our experiences is unanimous that rearranging physical matter does not give you agency. So if you want to claim that rearranging physical matter will bring you agency from an evidential perspective, you have to provide something.
I'm not sure where he's getting that, because I don't think anyone's really putting forth that if we rearrange matter, all of a sudden we're going to get agency. I think agency is a label that we put on things we recognize as having sentience. I don't think I think we're really playing with words here, because if I can recognize if something's sentient or something's self-aware, and then I can say that's an agent, I don't need to be able to really rearrange matter. And the fact that I can't rearrange matter, or that human beings can't rearrange matter to create sentience, well, in a sense that does happen, though, because any reproduction would involve non-agents, would involve non-sentient material. You have sperm and egg, and that's so that would be non-agents material without agency would be creating an agent. Now, probably the argument would be that, well, it requires the agent for those things to grow, but that still doesn't. But it still means the material is not. That doesn't make the materials that created that thing. Yeah, see, that's going to be another problem I have with that, because in a sense you could play around with the words again, and I could say we could put these two things together that do not have agency, and over time we will get agency. And the thing about it too is the agency will be it'll progress on a spectrum. Even after a child's born, we still don't say that it has perfect agency. It has this ability to reason, and it has this ability to differentiate. It has this ability to deliberate on things. Newborn babies aren't making conscious decisions. So in a sense, I don't think that it could be argued that in the same way he's arguing for free will from an agent perspective, he would argue that newborn children he would say are agents, he wouldn't say that they also have free will, because they just respond to things that they see in the universe, which is what I think happens throughout our entire lives, to be honest. I think we just get better at recognizing patterns. I think we just get better we get more adapted to our environment. Newborn babies have no adaptation. They're brand new. They are seeing everything for the first time. They're experiencing everything for the first time. So the fact that this part of the argument isn't very compelling to me either, because we do see, in a sense, I would be interested to hear what he says about that, but we do see not material that has no agency giving way to something that does have agency.
Now, some people will go and say, well, science can't do this yet. Science, that is.
I love that. Talk about blind faith. Sorry, go on.
You're right. It's a naturalism of the Gaps Fallacy. They talk about God of the Gaps Fallacies all the time. They on the other side of this. But really, anytime someone says, well, science hasn't explained this yet, it's a naturalism of the Gaps Fallacy.
No, that's not what that is. Sorry. Science hasn't explained this yet means we do not know the explanation. That does not mean that is not saying that science will explain this. That is saying that science has not explained this. That we are not offering an explanation. The God of the Gaps Fallacy that you're kind of juxtaposing that with and trying to make that kind of snide comparison is when someone says we can't explain this, therefore God must have done it. This naturalism of the Gaps Fallacy that you said that people do is not happening. No one is saying science can't explain it now, but science will explain it. That would be the fallacy. So that needs to be revised. That's kind of that's a big straw man right there.
It's assuming that it's something science can explain, but when all evidence suggests that merely rearranging matter just produces something akin to a calculator where there's no personal agency, that seems like a pretty unwarranted assumption.
That's what, and right there, that's what he said. We're producing something that's akin to a calculator. We created this human, you know. So it's, and because we took non-agency matter without agency, and created this human being that has agency. Therefore, it's like a calculator where it just takes in input and spits out output. That isn't a problem. Even if that was true, that's not a problem, because it's not about whether or not it's it's just spitting out the same a predetermined reaction. It's about whether that reaction is consistently verifiable. It's about whether that action produces good results. Because if the calculator was constantly, if the input was coming in and the output was constantly bad, was constantly wrong, that agent isn't going to last very long. It's going to have a hard time surviving. And we see that happen. We actually see that happen in nature. We see people that are born without cognitive abilities, or through birth defects, what have you. They get in accidents, things like that, and they have to be taken care of by someone who does possess these abilities to a higher degree than they do, to help them stay alive. So it would seem, from what we see, what we can observe, that his analogy about a calculator is actually pretty accurate. Now, he may not like that. He may think that doesn't, I don't like the fact that we're just calculators spitting, taking in input, spitting out output. I don't like that we don't have free will the way I want us to have free will. I would say tough. You need to show that you have this free will that you actually think you have. You have this what you call agency that you think you have. I would say agency is just something, as a label we apply to things we can see as having sentience. Now, the fact that we hold people accountable for things, the fact that we, put people in jail for crimes, and it's like, oh, it wasn't actually their fault or something because they didn't actually have time. They weren't actually able to make a choice, or weren't actually able to, deliberate and decide which way to go. It just, something came in their brain and they did this. I would say we can have a discussion on that. And you may be right. We may not have any justification for doing that. That does not change what is. Whether we have justification for something is aside from what is actually the case. And so far, your analogy seems to be the better one. Seems to be that we are like a calculator, that we take in input, spit out output, and these are, in a sense, determined, but they're not predetermined by anything outside of us. They are predetermined by the fact that we enjoy surviving, the fact that we are evolutionarily descended from creatures that also like surviving. Because if you're descended from creatures that don't like surviving, you never exist in the first place, because those creatures don't exist long enough to reproduce. So
I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad you also talked about artificial intelligence, because this is one of the big debates right now in terms of the ethics of artificial intelligence, specifically with regard to self-driving cars. The car, Tesla or Google or whoever's making these cars, has to equip the car to be able to make pseudo-ethical decisions. In other words, if there is a person on the road and the car is driving along a mountainside road with no railing, does the car, and let's say it's impossible to stop, okay, the road is slippery. Imagine a worst case scenario. The car can't stop, and the only options are ramming the person in front of you or steering off the edge of the cliff. The car doesn't have an ethical compass of its own. All it can do is whatever it was programmed by its engineers and whoever's putting that data into it, those counterfactuals into it. All it can do is what it's been programmed to do. So it's like, if we are just a product of naturalism, we as human entities we only have what's been put into us. So if the nature,
the problem with that analogy, though, is that the car does not recognize a person. A car is not sentient. and that's what the difference in with it would be with a calculator also. The car is not sentient. The calculator is not sentient. A car does not recognize what the difference between a person and an inanimate object is. So it doesn't have that ability to take in that particular input from the universe. So the fact that we have that ability to process that type of input does not mean that we are somehow we're more efficient in that sense. If we are to say our brain is like a computer and we're just responding, we're spitting out output as input is put in from around us. We may be a better computer than this car you're talking about. So to try to liken that to humans or other sentient creatures doesn't really work, because you're just saying that, well, this one's better at recognizing things than this one is. So I guess I would agree we're a better computer.
I don't want to mangle the phrase you used, but I really liked it. It's like the nature of it was something along the lines of metaphysics, but you didn't say metaphysics, like the actual nature of the world, or
the fundamental nature of reality.
That's it. The fundamental nature of reality. If it's impersonal, then we're just the product of impersonal forces, and all we have is what's been put into us. And if that's a random process, a determinative, whether it's either chaotic and random or it's determinative, we are either therefore random or just deterministic. There is no actual agency there, because there's no agency that went into our makeup, right? There's no agency that could input agency into us. Is that sort of a fair restatement of what you're saying?
Yeah. So it's like agency isn't the type of thing that you can get from non-agency.
Yeah, I think it is. I think agency is just something we apply to something that we recognize in the universe. I don't think it. I mean, we can also point out that agency is not just this one thing. There are things that have more agency than others. So it exists on a broad spectrum. And you could even make the argument that, and I think what he's saying is he's using agency for free will. In which case I may have a problem with saying that agency is even a thing. So if he's not using that for free will, then we can just deal with agency is what we would also call sentience, self-awareness. Awareness of your surroundings, kind of thing like that. So I don't see how that's a problem, saying that this is just, okay, this is more sentient than this has more agency than this. Because that's fine. We can recognize that we can see that kind of thing happening all around us. We can see that kind of thing through animal kingdom, through human being, even just in human beings, we see that some things have more agency than others. We would not expect the same agency from a newborn as we would from an adult. So if you wanted to argue that agency is one thing, that a newborn has the same agency as an adult, I don't see how you're going to be able to really accomplish that with a good argument.
Now, think of it. The example I've used before is, it's like all we have is red bricks. Agency is a blue wall. It doesn't matter how you rearrange the red bricks.
Okay, so why is agency a blue wall, but all we have are red bricks? So all we have is physical matter, and agency is non-physical. So the fact that, I mean, we could say the same thing about hunger or love or anything that is not material. We could say all we have is, how do you get love out of things that are just physical, because love is not physical. Ignoring the fact that these, from what we can see, these are emergent properties. These are just labels we put on things. These are just labels that we attach to things that are sentient.
Bricks, you will never get a blue wall.
That's good.
That's just not going to happen.
That's good.
And that's where, when it seems to be that agency is that type of thing. And from an evidential standpoint, I don't need to have anything approaching 100% certainty of this. So for someone to come up and tell me, well, how do you know for sure that there's no way to get agency from non-agency? I'll say, look, everything we've done before, everything we've done to rearrange matter has failed to produce agency. And the basic foundations of how science works, how structuring matter works, there's nothing intrinsically obvious about.
See, this is actually the God of the Gaps Fallacy. Everything we've done so far to do this, to rearrange matter, has not produced agency, therefore God. Because the title of this video is, why does agency require God? This is a blatant God of the Gaps fallacy. That's amazing to me, because he wants to argue that it's using naturalism in the gaps, which he was wrong about. He got that wrong. This is, we haven't been able to do this yet. Why does agency require God? Is the title of my video. Well, you haven't shown that agency does require God. You've just basically just stated that what we heard. You've just stated that we haven't been able to do this yet, and that's your evidence. That's fallacious. We could be done at that right there. We could be done with, well, science hasn't been able to manipulate matter and produce agency, therefore God.
Saying I can rearrange matter in this way and get agency. There's nothing on the table to do that, so why wouldn't I be within my rights to say agency needs to come from an agent?
Because that's a God of the gaps. Because that is a fallacious argument to say that if so far we haven't. What is this idea that we are at the pinnacle of just scientific discovery and ability right now? Where does that come from? I don't understand that kind of arrogance. Say, well, if we haven't done it yet, we're never going to do it. It seems very, very, very strange to me, because that does make it a blatant God of the gaps fallacy. Sorry, I'm checking things as I watch.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like, if you want to make that case and you believe in something like evidence, you need to be able to give some evidence for that. And what you're saying is, as far as we can see, there is no evidence for that.
I hope you enjoyed that discussion. I know it covered a lot of ground, but I think it's really important for us to understand the concepts that we addressed. So if you want to dig deeper than we were able to in just those couple of clips, I encourage you to check out the full interview over at the Think Institute. And I've included a link in the description below so you could easily access it. So click on the link, watch the full interview, and while you're there, consider subscribing to the Think.
So basically, I think what this does, this whole, we see agency, therefore there must be a fundamental nature to reality, must be an agent. That is a textbook composition division fallacy. Saying that because we see this thing in these parts of the universe, the fundamental nature of the universe must also be this. There's a problem there, because he's very impressed by agency. He's not impressed by non-agency. I could also say that because we see non-agents in the universe, therefore the fundamental nature of reality must be a non-agent. But then Lucas doesn't think that's the case, because he thinks that you can't get agency from non-agency. Excuse me. I see a lot of problems with this. I see a lot of a couple of fallacies. Mainly, there was the blatant God of the gaps fallacy, and then, from what I can tell, also a composition fallacy. I'd love to have him on for a discussion about it someday. Maybe I'll reach out to him and try to set that up. But the link to the original video is in the description if you want to go watch it for yourself, or go to his channel. Go subscribe to the channel. It's a great channel. He has great content. Puts it together very well. I do have a few issues with some of the arguments that he makes. But maybe we can watch another one real quick. We have a little time left. Let's see if I can go back to. Let's see if I can find another one. There's one I haven't seen yet.
A few weeks ago, I had the chance to be interviewed by my friend Joel Sedecase over at the Think Institute. And the topic of the interview was generally the question of, well, the relationship between science and faith. And one thing that I noticed about that interview is it provides a lot of opportunities to sort of zero in on some specific topics, some challenges, some questions, some concerns that we as Christians should have or encounter when thinking about the relationship between science and faith. And the reason I wanted to sort of isolate the series of clips that we have here in this video is because it comes in the context of responding to an atheist challenging us that miracles are really just as silly as magic. And what you'll find is a great exchange between myself and Joel that I think sheds some light on how to understand and respond to this type of challenge. I kind of chuckle at that because obviously the relationship between the miraculous and magic is meant to be silly, right? It's meant to be this sort of farcical attempt at, I wouldn't say mocking us, but really that's what it is, right? They're assuming magic is fictitious. Magic is just something you go, you see a magician do a trick, but really there's no such thing as magic.
Right.
So if they're going to make this comparison, then what they are saying, in effect, is that the miraculous is impossible. But what does that actually mean?
Well, the thing is, when we say there's no such thing as magic, you just said there's no such thing as magic. When they say magic, we're talking about things that violate the natural order, things that violate laws of physics, things that basically are able to circumvent these things that, in a sense, run the universe. So that's what we're talking about when we say magic. We're also talking about the supernatural, which you would probably say, I'm assuming, does exist. So when you say that magic doesn't exist, you're going to have to differentiate between which supernatural things you do think exist and which ones you say don't exist. Because as far as I can tell, magic would fall within that realm of things that are not bound by the same physical laws that we are bound by.
Well, if you're going to say the miraculous is impossible, at a minimum, you have to say that God does not exist. So any of those people who consider themselves to be weak atheists.
So God's the only one that can do miracles. That doesn't follow because miracles could exist without a God. So that's the problem here. There's all these things that don't logically follow with the other, that he just says, "Oh, you have to assume this." No, you don't. It's a very very big problem in your argumentation.
Who say that, oh, I don't say that God doesn't exist. I just say I'm not convinced that God does exist. This sort of comparison is off the table because in order to make the comparison, you have to say that the miraculous is fictitious, or it's like something that we know to be fictitious. So God must be fictitious in order for that analogy to hold. And even if God does exist, then they'd have to go ahead, even if they say, well, maybe God exists, but God wouldn't interact with the universe, they'd have to argue that, or they'd have to argue that it would be some sort of...
No, you would have to argue that God does interact with the universe. That's not how your question doesn't work, or your statement doesn't work, because no one has to argue that God does not interact with the universe. Someone will have to argue that God does interact with the universe. First, you have to argue that a God exists and that it can interact with the universe, what method it uses to interact with that universe, and then show instances where it has been demonstrated to have actually happened. There's a lot of work ahead of you there that theists haven't even done. So when you skip ahead 4 or 5 steps and just say we're going to assume all of that, that leads up to it, that's a dishonest argumentation. You're leaving out steps 1, 2, and 3 and skipping to step 4 and assuming steps 1, 2, and 3 actually happen, and we both agree on that. We don't.
Impossibility of him interacting. There are all sorts of these burdens that the atheist just cannot bear if they want to go ahead and say the miraculous is impossible. And that's effectively what this sort of argument is.
I don't think that's what the question was, though. The question wasn't, is it impossible? The question was, is it silly? See, let me back up a second to make sure I read the question right. Okay, well, no, I think someone said it was silly. The question says, how does saying an appeal to the miraculous is an appeal to magic? He said, well, magic doesn't exist, so it's not correct. Miracles do exist. That's not an answer to the question. That's just saying, well, one's real and one's not. You haven't given any demonstration how to tell the difference between the two. What what this question is really asking is, if I appeal to the miraculous, why is that any more rational than to appeal to magic? Why should that be seen as more rational? And so because you can't show, because what we're talking about is, what confidence level should I have? That's what he's missing in this question is, why should we place confidence that these things happen and not these? Because from where we stand, they seem to both miracles and magic seem to warrant the same confidence level.
Argument is.
The way I've heard it compared is this, and the credit goes to Doug Wilson on this. It's like, if you, try. We say we don't believe in magic, but we believe in miracles. But then you read the Gospels. Try explaining to your 6-year-old that Jesus turning water into wine is not magic.
Okay. That's amazing to me. We believe in miracles, but not magic. So then we go to the book and we say, these are miracles, not magic. It's amazing.
That's pretty magical. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like Jesus feeding 5,000 people. So it's like, well, if you want to call it magic, okay. That just means that God can do magic. But that's just another word for miracle. If we're saying
amazing. We're just going to use those two words as the same. That's how we get around that. Sorry, Joel, that's not how things work. What Nate Werner was asking you, the person asking the question, you see this thing as silly. You see this thing as something we should not have any reason to put any confidence in. So how do you get around that when you make appeals to something else that we really see no reason to have confidence in? And then so to just say, oh well, those are the same thing. We're just going to make the words synonymous. Great. Show us why we have reason to have confidence in it then. That's the part of the question you're missing. That's the core of the question is, why should we have confidence in these claims, in these appeals to the miraculous or to magic or whatever else you want to call it?
Magic is absurd and impossible, like you just said. Well, no, God's not absurd. God's not impossible. But if all we're saying is that the creator of the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry and biology, can suspend those laws when he chooses to for his own purposes, well, you can call that miracles, magic, or whatever you want to call it. It's just God doing that. The Bible calls them signs and wonders.
Right.
So it all depends on how you define things. So
right.
I kind of like the idea that, yeah, Jesus did magic, but it was real magic. And it's,
right.
We call them miracles, we call them signs and wonders, but one thing we can't call them is impossible if God exists. So everything really does hinge on.
We can't say things impossible if God exists. Well, no, we can, because if you would say God does these things outside the bounds of the things that we are restricted by, and then we could get into the very common things like, could God make a square circle, and could God make a married bachelor, things like that. Could God lift the rock could make the rock so heavy that he couldn't lift it? Because those things are impossible. They're definitionally impossible. So is God restricted by definitions? we could sit here and have that conversation, but it seems that you saying God can do the impossible means that he can also do things that violate logic. And if God can violate logic, then he can be both God and not God simultaneously, which means that God can both exist and not exist simultaneously, which means that if I say God does not exist, then I'm not appealing to anything more than you are when you say God does exist. So this whole video seems to have missed this question entirely. It seems to miss the point of the question. What's the reason we should have confidence in these appeals to the miraculous? Because by definition, a miracle is something that either happens once or so little that it cannot be replicated, tested, observed, or shown to have a cause, or shown what the cause is. It has a cause, I'm sorry. Shown to the cause cannot be demonstrated. We cannot make a causal connection between the event and what caused the event because of the fact that it either rarely happens or only happens once. So just by definition alone, these things can't be, we can have no confidence in what caused them. Because in order to show a causal connection, you're going to have to have something that's repeatable and testable. And I think that's why this question alone kind of demonstrates, if we discuss it more, we get into it more, it really does unveil the irrationality of it. It really does make it no more than an appeal to magic, something that we recognize as something we can have no confidence in, something we can have no use for.
On that, right?
And another route you could take is simply say, okay, well, have you interacted with the work of someone like Craig Keener, who has a 2-volume set of cataloging miracle accounts, modern day miracle accounts, and they're with various degrees of attestation. But I mean, to say that this assumption that the miraculous is sort of unanimously considered to be absurd, well, that's not actually true when you actually look at how common claims to the miraculous are. Now, those may not be true claims in every case, but you can't start from this basis that it is absurd.
So he's putting claims of the miraculous as evidence that the miraculous is a real thing. But then right behind it admits, well, these aren't all true claims. That's incredible. To me, that's like that should go off. That should signal off in your head that you are completely cherry picking things and saying, oh, I'm going to count this, but not this. But all of it together is evidence that the thing that I've picked should be considered and we should place a higher confidence in this. Even though out of this whole group, we have things that I would agree aren't true. To me, that doesn't work at all.
But even on just the process of the miraculous, I have to throw this out there because it's a book I read earlier this year. It's called Divine Action, Determinism, and the Laws of Nature. It's by Jeffrey Kapersky, and it is one of the most phenomenal reads I've ever read. If you want to buy the hardcover version, it's like $155, but it might still be free on Kindle. So there's that. Oh, wow. That's how I read it. But great. He actually goes through this. It's super rich, super philosophical, and super scientific. So
tell us the name of that book one more time.
Divine Action, Determinism, and the Laws of Nature. I hope that exchange was helpful to you in understanding how to respond to this sort of challenge where someone says that the miraculous is just as absurd as magic. But if you want to dig deeper, I encourage you to check out the...
Okay, so again, it seems like they missed the point of the comparison. Because the question is, we have this thing that we would both agree, as far as the question was asked, we have this thing, magic, that we both kind of agree would be irrational to place our confidence in, appeals to magic. saying that this was caused by magic, caused by something supernatural. The cause is what the question was referencing. Not the fact that, not whether or not they exist or not whether or not these things happen. Because if I label something a miracle or I label something as magic, that doesn't mean it was a miracle or it was magic. The question was saying, what's the basis for calling it that? And how do we have confidence, or why should we have confidence in thinking we know the cause for that?
The 2 links in the description to Craig Keener's works on miracles and Jeffrey Kapersky's work on divine action, determinism, and the laws of nature. But in addition to that, you can go to the Think Institute via the link in the description to watch the full interview that I had with Joel. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to the Think Institute. In addition, the question of...
Okay, so yeah, head over to that, head over to the page, to Catalyzing Faith, and subscribe to the channel. Give a look at the videos. Again, there seems to be a lot of nuances getting missed in some of these videos. More so in this one, I think, because the question seems to have kind of been misinterpreted. The way I would interpret that question is, where should we place our confidence level? Out of these 2 things, which one should we place a higher confidence in? Magic or miracles? Well, Lucas seems to think that miracles actually happen, magic doesn't. Joel seems to think that magic and miracles are the same thing, because we're just going to change those words out. So now if we can just change those words out, how do we differentiate between the 2? Because it seems that one has a cause that Lucas would not agree with, and one has a cause that Lucas would think is actually real. So that becomes the problem, is how do we differentiate the 2? How do we show a causal connection? And how do we give rise to a confidence level that warrants justified belief? So I'm probably going to leave it at that for the day. Said I did this off the cuff. I didn't really have a lot of time to prepare. Hopefully I'll do better next time. If you've never been, if you're not subscribed to the channel, do me a favor, help me out, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button even. And if you have any suggestions, comments, concerns, leave them in the comment section, and I tend to respond to most of them. So thank y'all for coming. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.